Okay, so we'll begin. Are there questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, I'll start. So let me briefly recall where we were yesterday. So we are quantizing Maxwell's theory coupled to electromagnetism. Okay. And in that theory, we defined several things. Okay. First of all, we defined this quantity A tilde mu, okay, which has the property that its transverse components are the same as the original gauge field transverse components. Okay. But for example, its zero component has been set to zero, even though the original gauge field, okay, does have a non-zero zero component. Okay, and that's in fact proportional to J0. So we define this curly A tilde mu in this fashion, and the J mu is the electromagnetic current, which is defined here. So based on this, we constructed the Rauthian. Okay, and because we had eliminated in the Rauthian the A0 variable, okay, it's as good as a Hamiltonian. Okay, so I'll call this the sum of two parts, the free Hamiltonian and the interacting Hamiltonian. So the free Hamiltonian had this structure. So you can see that this is quadratic in the momenta, quadratic in the gauge fields. And there is a Dirac, the free Dirac Hamiltonian, okay, which is also quadratic in the field psi and psi bar. Okay. So this part of the Hamiltonian is identical to what we had for free Maxwell theory, that's this part, and the free Dirac theory, that's this part. And then there is an interaction part, okay, which had two parts. Okay. One was some kind of contact interaction, okay, which is given here. Integral over these two space coordinates r and r prime, okay, of this Green's function grr prime, which is defined here, okay, and the product of two charge densities J0 times J0 at r and r prime. Okay. So this is non-local in space but local in time. As you can see, the J0 at the same time are taken products of. Okay. And this is another term in the interaction. Okay, so this involves two psis and two psi bars. This involves is one psi bar, and one gauge field. And so the goal today will be to derive the Feynman rules based on this action, okay, or this Hamiltonian. So are there any questions on this? Okay.
So,
yes, go ahead, please.
as a general rule, when we take this Fourier transform, we aren't really worrying about whether these fields actually have L2 norm or not.
Yeah, basically the point is you say that you integrate or you these are quantum fields, right? So its degrees of freedom depends on the basis that you choose to expand it. So in a sense, you define them to have L2 norm, right? You quantize using, by demanding that the fields have L2 norm.
So that would correspond to like the classical equations having a solution with a functional form that has L2 norm well defined.
Yeah, you can say it that way.
But I mean, are we sure that that is the case for all these fields?
Okay, what I'm saying is that when you say whether it is the case for all these fields, the boundary condition on the fields is something that you have to impose. Right? By changing the boundary condition, you may change the quantization laws. For example, suppose you impose periodic boundary condition, right? Then there will be a different kind of quantization.
Yeah.
So what the fields do at infinity is something that you impose. Right? Once you have put the boundary condition, then you choose a basis of states appropriate to that boundary condition, expand the field in that basis, and then you say that you will quantize by regarding the coefficients of expansion as the independent dynamical variables. Right? So the basis is such that is suitable for expanding an L function with L2 norms. Then you are guaranteed that this will be the case, right? Here, of course, the basis that you have chosen are plane waves, right, which by themselves don't have L2 norm, but functions which do have L2 norm can be expanded in that basis.
Yeah.
right? And as we saw for, actual analysis of the S matrix and things like that, we basically work with wave packets, right? A
Yeah.
broad Gaussian which has both localized momentum and localized coordinates. And there, of course, by construction, it has L2 norm.
Yeah.
So this is the boundary condition is something that you basically impose on the fields, right? It's your choice that you will quantize subject to this boundary condition. And if you change the boundary condition, the quantization may change.
Yeah. All right.
So that is understood in this. Are the other questions? Okay. So from this, as we discussed last time, okay, even though we have a interaction part, okay, we'll think of these as small, okay, and we'll see that the smallness basically comes from E, because you can see that J, the expression for J has an E, right? So this term, for example, has an explicit power of E square. This term has an explicit power of E. So as long as E is small, okay, you can think of H interaction being small, and you can do perturbation theory. And the idea is that we'll carry out the perturbation theory by going to the interaction picture. So we take H free at some fixed time T naught as our unperturbed Hamiltonian. We define the interaction picture as the one in which the fields evolve by H naught. And then we carry out the standard perturbation analysis that we did for the scalar field theory. So it is in that sense you have to regard these equations. So when I say mu propagator, it's really the propagator of the mu in the interaction picture, right? Mu y. So this is the 2-point function of mu y, nu y, and the expectation value is in the vacuum of H free at T naught, right? That's what one means by mu propagator. But in any case, the main point is that with that understanding, the mu propagator takes the same form as we had in the free field theory, in free Maxwell's theory, because this part of the Hamiltonian is identical to what we had for free Maxwell's theory. And the relationship between A tilde mu and A tilde b, this is also exactly what we had for the free Maxwell's theory. So then we can read out the mu propagator from the free Maxwell's theory. This was the form of the mu propagator. And this is the form of the d tilde mu nu p, which is the Fourier transformed version of the propagator. And here I should just mention that I have made a correction to the sign. Okay, this sign earlier I had written as plus, but the actual sign in fact is minus. Okay, and you can I have corrected the notes where I actually derived it. Okay? And basically there's a minus sign error in writing p bar in terms of p. Okay, so this is the correct sign, I think, as far as I can see. Okay, so this is the photon propagator and this is the fermion propagator, right? Again, because of the in H free, this is just the free Dirac Hamiltonian. The propagator for the fermion will be identical to what we had for the free Dirac theory. So that's SF alpha beta. And now the interaction terms. Okay, the first term, this term in the interaction, in H interaction, will give an interaction with 2 psis and 2 psi bars, right? Because this is psi bar gamma naught psi bar gamma naught psi. So this term has 2 psi bars and 2 psis. So that's how it's written here. That this is psi bar interaction vortex. And the second term here has 1 psi bar from J mu and 1 A. Right? So that will give a psi bar A interaction vortex. And I'll write down the explicit notation in the Feynman diagram language in the next slide. So are there questions? Okay. So what we are going to argue now is that the term that is proportional to n mu in this, right? You can see that this d tilde mu nu has a term proportional to n mu n nu. Okay. This term cancels the effect of the 4 fermion interaction term, psi bar. Okay, and I'll explain in what sense this cancellation takes place. Okay, the term proportional to n mu n nu. So this is the internal propagator. Cancels this 4 fermion interaction term. Okay, so here I have drawn the propagator. So normally the propagator for the photon is denoted by a wavy line. Okay, so this is the notation that I'll be using for the propagator of a photon or a gauge field, which I'll denote by d mu nu xy. And this is the propagator for the fermion. This we had already introduced. Okay. Remember that arrow. Okay. So the arrow is drawn in the convention that the direction towards which the arrow goes, that's the psi. Okay. And the direction from which the arrow comes, that's psi bar. Okay. So SF alpha beta, okay, was a psi bar propagator, right? The first was psi. So in the free theory, this was the expectation value of psi alpha, psi bar beta, right? Time ordered product. That's why the alpha index here is on the left, the beta index is on the right. Okay, SF, and it's going from basically the arrow goes from beta to alpha. So with the same notation, we can now write down the interaction vortices. Okay. So this interaction term, okay, this vortex is a consequence of the this term over here. Okay. So there's a minus sign here, okay, and then there's a minus sign there, so that makes it plus. So there's an E here, and there's a gamma mu. Okay, gamma mu index. Remember that the first index refers to psi bar, the second index refers to psi. Okay, so this we should keep in mind. Okay. And of course, in the whole perturbation series, the H in the exponent, H interaction is multiplied by minus I. Okay, so that minus I always accompanies H interaction. So that you should remember. So based on this, we get that this interaction vortex. There's a minus. This is the minus I that multiplies H interaction. This is a E, right? That comes from the E in the J mu expression. Okay, and that this minus sign has already cancelled as we discussed. So you have a gamma mu. The gamma mu, remember that was psi bar gamma mu psi. So the beta index should refer to psi bar, alpha index should refer to psi. Okay. And indeed, that is the convention I have followed because psi always the arrow flows towards psi, right? So the alpha index, you see the alpha index should be the on the line in which the arrow is coming towards the vortex. Beta index will be on the line in which the arrow is going away from the vortex. Okay. And because the beta refers to psi bar and alpha refers to psi, it's gamma mu beta alpha. Right? That's the expression for this vortex. So if you see this vortex in a Feynman diagram, you know that the expression that you have to write for this is this. And if you see these propagators, the expression that you have to write for these is these or these. Then you have the four fermion interaction, psi bar psi, psi bar psi. Now, normally, since it's a single interaction term, one should have drawn it by a single vortex, okay, with two psis coming in, two psi bars coming in, going out arrows. But here I have drawn it in a slightly different way, okay, just because this has these two integrals, right, dq bar prime. I have separated this. This is still a single vortex. This is not a propagator. This we should keep in mind. But this is just a way of denoting this single vortex to ensure that there are two integrals to be done. Okay, there is an integral associated with this vortex and there is an integral associated with this vortex. Okay. So there is a d cube r and a d cube r prime. Okay. But in order to make life simple, I have also introduced a delta function, okay, which tells us that the times of this vortex and this vortex are the same. Okay. So with this delta function being part of the vortex, I can now do full integral over d4x and d4y. I think it says I have been signed out, but I'm not sure. You can probably still see me, right?
Yeah.
Or hear me. Okay. I hope that this continues. Okay. So is this point clear? Okay. Let me do one thing. I'll stop sharing and send out a message. Okay, let's hope that it works. Okay, other questions, comments so far?
Sir,
Yes, go ahead, please.
uh, when we are doing the scalar field, lambda was the coupling constant, but lambda was something that was given, but E should be something that we can measure. So can we use it as a coupling constant?
Yeah, see, the point is that even in scalar field theory, when you apply it for practical purpose, lambda is something that you will measure, right? So in that sense, it is true that experimentally E has some very definite value. Okay? But theoretically, okay, E is a parameter of the theory. And so you can do an expansion in powers of E. And the value of E actually is small, right? Because the actual expansion parameter is E squared, okay, in dimensionless units, and that's like 1 over 137. So it is true that E is not adjustable experiment. I mean, in nature, E is fixed, right? But in theory, if you just think of QED as an abstract theory, then E can take any value that you like, right? Your theory is perfectly consistent even for any E. That's why you take E as a coupling constant in which you expand. Okay. But as I said, this of course will be useful only if E is small, right? And in nature, E happens to be small. Is this clear?
Yes.
Any other question? Okay, so let me go ahead and try to describe this, where these things come from. Okay. These basically come from the fact that these are coming from the product of two J0s, right? It's J0 product, and J0 has psi bar gamma naught psi. Okay, so you get a factor of gamma naught from the first J0, okay, gamma naught beta alpha, and from the second zero you get gamma naught beta prime alpha prime. Again, you have to keep in mind that the first index, the beta index, is for psi bar. Okay, so the arrow should come out of that index. Second index is for psi, so the arrow should go towards that index. And indeed, you can see from this that is the convention. Okay, the arrow goes into psi. Okay, so this is the psi index. That's why it's beta alpha, and this is the psi bar index. Similarly here, okay, alpha prime is the psi index, beta prime is the psi bar index. And as minus I, of course, is part of the minus I that's in the H interaction. And this minus half basically is part of the term, this term. Okay, the minus half comes from here. Okay, is this clear? Are there any questions? Okay, so now let's discuss the cancellation that I mentioned. Okay, so let me remind you what I said, that this vortex, okay, the effect of this vortex in the Feynman diagram is cancelled by the n mu term in the propagator, okay, by this term. Okay, and let me explain in what sense it cancels. Okay. So let's suppose that you have a Feynman diagram, okay, in which we have used this 4-fermion interaction vortex. Okay, this is a single vortex, okay, even though you have written it this way. Now, given this part of the Feynman diagram, okay, there is another Feynman diagram where the rest of the diagram remains unchanged. Okay, but this solid line, which was part of the 4-fermion interaction vortex, is replaced by a fermion propagator, by a photon propagator, right? Because there's a coupling of gauge field using two fermions using this vortex. Okay, so you use this vortex here, the same vortex here, okay, and here you replace it by a photon propagator. So this contribution from the general Feynman rules is given by d mu nu xy. Okay, that's a propagator. Okay. And then the vortex. What is the vortex? Each vortex gives you minus I. So you have minus I squared, and then gamma mu alpha beta gamma mu beta prime alpha prime. Okay, that's what we have here. Okay. This half, okay, is a combinatoric factor. Okay, and this I have counted this half here just by thinking that this is the full Feynman diagram. Okay, suppose these are the full Feynman diagram, then you see that you have used this vertex twice. Okay, when you replace this by a propagator, right, then this vertex comes twice, right? And as you know, when you expand H interaction, you always get 1 over n factorial if you use n parts of H interaction, right? So if you use the same vertex n times, you get 1 over n factorial. So these 2 is coming from there. Okay, assuming that there's nothing else in the Feynman diagram. That this is all the Feynman, all that is there in the Feynman diagram. Now, d mu nu, of course, has many terms, but we focus on the part of d mu nu that comes from the n mu n nu term. And that you can read out from here. This is the part of d mu nu that is here. N mu n nu p square over p vector square times this. So this is what I have written here. Okay, so this is the part of d mu nu that is coming from the n mu n nu term, and this is the Fourier transform. Now here you see, first of all, that there is a p square in the denominator, p square in the numerator. So these 2 cancel. Okay, and because there is a p square in the numerator, the I epsilon really plays no role, right? Because the pole is cancelled anyway, right? I epsilon is playing a role if the pole, to say which way you should integrate around the pole, right? But if the pole is cancelled, then I epsilon has no role. So these 2 just cancel, gives a minus sign. So that's this minus I. So once these cancel, then the p naught dependence comes only from the exponent. Okay, because this p vector square, of course, p bar square is just p vector square. Okay. So the p naught dependence comes from the exponent. So the integral over p naught gives you a delta function. So that gives you delta times x naught minus 2 pi delta times x naught, delta of x naught minus y naught. So the 2 pi cancels this one of the 2 pi's. So you are left with d cube p over 2 pi cube e to the I p vector dot x minus y, and then n mu nu over p vector square. And this, of course, you will not recognize as our gxy, right? The definition of gxy had a minus sign, but otherwise it's exactly this. Gxy, yes, here. You see, other than the minus sign, you have exactly this expression that we got there. So you get I times delta x naught minus y naught n mu n nu times gxy. And so here now, if you look at only the n mu n nu part of d mu nu, we get this expression over here. Okay, this minus I square gives you minus e square, that's the minus sign. Then I by 2, this I and this half gives you I by 2 times this. And this becomes gamma naught because n, if you remember, n has only 0th component 1 and everything else 0. So when you contract n mu n nu with gamma mu, you get gamma naught. Okay, so that's these 2 factors. And now you see that this term over here exactly cancels the 4 fermion vortex, which is here. Okay, this was I by 2 times delta x naught minus y naught times gxy. This is minus I by 2. So there is exact cancellation between these 2. Are there questions? So here the part that I have not done fully, okay, I have glossed over, is the combinatoric factor. Okay. This half that we got, this was of course true if this was a full entire diagram. Okay. But by doing a careful analysis, one can show that even if there are other parts of the diagram, right, where the combinatoric factors will be more complicated, this cancellation still holds. And essentially what you show is that the combinatoric factor associated with the rest of the diagram are of course common between the 2 diagrams. Okay, so they can be factored out. And then the relevant part, okay, where you have to combine them, basically has this extra factor of half between these 2 lines. Okay, that's the way one can show this. This I'll leave to you as an exercise. Okay. The general idea is the same kind that we use, for example, to show that the bubble diagrams factorize. Right? we found a way to count combinatoric factors associated with the diagram with bubbles, okay, and showed that it's equal to the product of the combinatoric factor of the bubble and the combinatoric factor of the rest of the diagram. So the same kind of analysis will also work here. And these basically, yes, go ahead, please.
What you showed, isn't it just for internal vertices?
Yes, indeed. So
But
this replacement, right, will be done for the internal propagators, not for the external propagators. So in a Feynman diagram, right, there are, suppose you have external photons, right, then you have d tilde mu nu on the external lines, they will remain the full d mu nu.
yeah, that will have n nu term.
Yes, that will have n mu n nu term.
Yeah, okay.
Only the internal propagators, okay, that's why I said is in the internal photon propagator, we drop the n mu n nu term, okay, and we drop this interaction vortex.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other question?
Sir,
Yes, go ahead, please.
sir, in this 4 fermion interaction vortex,
Yes.
can you just go back to the diagram?
Yes.
Yeah. So here it's the solid line represents the contact interaction, right?
Indeed, yes.
So, but since this term, the contribution of this term cancels with the contribution of a star.
Yes. Not the whole of star, but part of the star.
Yeah, the part, the part of the star.
Yes.
So it means that this propagator also contains a non-local part, right?
Indeed, yes.
And that's why the cancellation holds.
Exactly. So the n mu n nu part is actually non-local term.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So basically the point, you started with a local theory, right? So you expect that locality should be preserved, and that's what you are saying here, right? That in the full theory there is not a violation of locality. Okay, even though if we just use this interaction, it looks like action at a distance, because it has the same time, right, but different space coordinates, right? That's clearly is action at a distance. Are the other questions? Okay, so basically what it does is to lead to simpler Feynman rules, okay, which is that we can drop the 4 fermion interaction vortex, okay, and for all the internal photons, okay, we'll use the modified photon propagator, okay, which I can call d prime mu nu, okay, where d prime mu nu basically has the same structure as the original photon propagator, except that the n mu n nu term is absent. Okay. And as I have told you earlier, but this is not something that I'll try to illustrate anymore in these lectures, is that when you actually calculate the S matrix element, okay, one can argue that these terms, any term that is proportional to P mu or P nu here, okay, which means all of these terms, in fact, drop out. Okay, in the S matrix element, they don't contribute after some of our diagrams. Okay. So effectively, then we can use the internal photon propagator as just this part, okay, eta mu nu over minus p square plus I epsilon. That makes the calculation much simpler, okay, even though the physical interpretation is easier in the Coulomb gauge that we have been using. So that is what is called the Feynman gauge, okay, where you take the internal photon propagator to be just I eta mu nu over minus p square plus I epsilon. So I'll leave it as an exercise for you to calculate these Green's functions. In fact, this will be part of the homework problem where I'll ask you to calculate S matrix element. Okay, so for that you have to first calculate these Green's functions. Okay. So you draw all possible Feynman diagrams for these, and then evaluate them using the Feynman rules that I have given here. And once you have got the position space Green's functions, you can also calculate the corresponding momentum space Green's functions. Okay. So at this stage, it's a good opportunity to give the actual definition of the momentum space Green's functions. Okay, in this case, for the scalars we had already introduced. Okay. So we'll define the momentum space Green's function okay, we'll denote this by G tilde. Okay. It will have two integers as arguments. So n denotes the number of photons. M denotes the number of size and number of psi bars. Okay, number of size and psi bars have to be the same. Okay, otherwise the Green's function will just vanish by charge conservation. So M here denotes both the size and the psi bars. These momenta k1 to kn will refer to the photons. These will refer to the size, okay, or the Fourier transform of the size, and these will refer to the Fourier transform of the psi bars. Okay. So let's look at the definitions. You have the integrals. These are the Fourier transform integrals as to the Fourier transform. You see there are n xi integral. This is associated with the photon in coordinates. These are associated with the size, okay, m of them, and these are associated with the psi bars, okay, again m of them. So this is the usual Fourier transform, the exponential, okay? And here is the position space Green's function. Okay? So you can see that the xi is referred to the photons, yj is referred to the size, and the z's referred to the psi bars. Okay? So that's the convention that I'll be using for this Green's function. Okay? And once I've defined the momentum space Green's function, okay, you can write down the momentum space Feynman rules as in the case of scalar field theory. Okay, so to calculate this G tilde nm, you don't have to go through we don't have to first calculate the position space Green's function and then take the Fourier transform. Okay. There are direct momentum space Feynman rules that tells you how to calculate G tilde nm. Okay. And this part of the analysis is very similar to what we had in the case of scalar field theory. Right? Basically, you have to use the momentum space propagators and the momentum space interaction vortices, and that's what will give the momentum space Green's functions directly. Okay. So I'll leave this as an exercise for you to do this. So you can, for example, this calculation, the momentum space Green's function calculation, you can either first do the position space one and then Fourier transform, or you can directly use the momentum space Feynman rules to find the momentum space Green's functions. Okay, are there questions? Okay, so if not, let me proceed. So now the point is, given the Green's functions, okay, we can ask what can we do, okay, because we have to ultimately connect it to physical observations. Okay. And here again, we proceed exactly as in the case of scalar field theory. Okay. In the scalar field theory, you had seen that given the Green's function, okay, you can use it to extract the physical masses of the theory and the physical S matrix elements. Okay. And that you can repeat for the quantum electrodynamics. Okay. So there are a few differences which I'll mention, okay, even though I'll not try to go through the detailed derivation of those differences. Okay. So let's begin with the fermion mass. Okay, how do you calculate the fermion mass given these Green's functions? So for this, we again proceed as in scalar field theory. We start with the two-point function. Okay. So two-point function of psi alpha of x, psi bar beta of y. Okay. And then we insert a complete set of states in between. Okay. So here for x naught larger than y naught, okay, it's psi alpha x, psi bar beta y, and we insert a complete set of states in the middle. Okay. For x naught less than y naught, it's psi bar beta of y first, then psi alpha of x. Okay, with a minus sign because these are fermionic variables. Okay. And again, we insert a complete set of states in the middle. Okay. So in general, of course, this sum will include all states, which include single particle as well as multi-particle states. Okay. But we will focus on single particle states. Okay, because as you saw that in order to extract the mass of the particle, we for the scalar fields, for example, we focused on the contribution from the single particles. Okay. And then he saw that the single particles give poles in the propagator. Okay. So that told us how to identify the mass of the particle. Okay. Basically, you look for the propagator in the momentum space and look for where the poles are. And we will do the same thing in this case. So if we look at this, then charge conservation tells us that only the single electron states contribute to the top expression. Okay. And that's because you see psi alpha has, if you remember the expression for expansion of psi alpha for in the free theory, okay, it has annihilation operator for the electron, okay, and creation operator for the positron. Okay. So that basically says that psi alpha carries positive charge, right? Because it either annihilates an electron or creates a positron. Okay. So, and the vacuum of course carries zero charge. Okay. So in order for this matrix element to be non-zero, this n must carry charge minus c. Okay, if this carries positive charge plus c, this must carry charge minus c. Okay. And that means that for the single particle state, it should be a state of a single electron, okay, ignoring the possibility of bound states, right? This is only a perturbative statement. Similarly here, okay, in the second expression, psi bar beta, okay, has an annihilation operator for the positron and creation operator for the electron. So here, okay, this state must be a positron state. Okay, again, the total charge must add up to zero. Okay. So that's what I've said here. Charge conservation tells us that only the single electron state contributes to top expression. This will denote by PS minus, and the single positron states, which are denoted by PS plus, contribute to the second expression. Okay, so this subscript minus or plus will refer to the charges of the state. And now the idea is that we will use the constant of Lorentz invariance, as in the case of scalar field theory, to simplify this expression. Okay, to see what is the most general expression of this kind. So this I'll not do in detail. Okay, this I'll leave it as an exercise. So basically the idea is that you look at this expression over here, omega psi alpha of x p. Okay. In the case of scalar field theory, what we had concluded, okay, first of all, the x dependence, okay, had the form e to the ip dot x. Okay, that came from translation invariance. Okay, and then we had omega psi alpha 0 p. Okay, and then we showed that it's independent of p. Okay, Lorentz invariance basically tells us that it's independent of p if it has a scalar. The same kind of analysis now tells us, okay, that that it's not independent of p, okay, but it has a very specific p dependence. Okay, and the specific p dependence that this matrix element has is this. Okay, if mf is the mass of the particle, that means if this state satisfies that energy is square root of p square plus mf square, is the physical mass of the particle. Okay, then up to a constant of proportionality, which I'm calling square root of z psi, okay, the p dependence of this matrix element must be of this form, okay, u alpha psm mf. Okay, so basically what you have to do is that you look at the Lorentz transformation property of this. Okay, what happens when you apply Lorentz generator on this? Okay, that gives you some condition on this, and then you have to show that this is the function that satisfies those conditions, that Lorentz invariance condition. Okay. The reason that it's not independent of p is because, unlike in the scalar field where the Lorentz generator commutes with this, okay, phi of 0, okay, this is not the case here, right? Psi alpha does transform under Lorentz transformation, and that's why you get this extra factor of u alpha. This is the conjugate relation. If you just conjugate this, you get this. Okay, conjugate this and then multiply by gamma naught. And here are similar relations for psi bar. For sorry, not psi bar, for PS plus. Okay, this is the state of the positron. Okay, other questions? So the only non-trivial part of this which was not present in the scalar field theory, is the appearance of these functions, right? The specific dependence on p through u alpha, okay, e alpha bar, okay, and then here v alpha bar, and v alpha. Okay. And as I said, these follow from Lorentz transformation, but you have to do some work to check that indeed this is the structure that you get. Okay. But the general rule of thumb, okay, that you can use to keep, remember what you expect, okay, is that just consider the case of a free field. If psi alpha had really been a free field, then this would have been the usual perturbative vacuum, right? 0. Okay. And then you know what this is. Okay. And this indeed is given by u alpha, right? Then there, of course, z would have been 1. You would have gotten the u alpha. Okay. In the interacting theory, it's the same relation that holds, because that relation, in fact, just follows from Lorentz invariance. Okay? Except that the overall constant can change. Right? That's all the freedom you have in this interacting field theory, and in general, this is a general relation that you'll have. So now all you have to do is that you have to take this and substitute here, okay? Where in the sum over n you restrict to single particle states, and it's clear what the result should be, right? Because in the if z psi had been 1, okay, you would have gotten the free fermion propagator, right? The single particle contribution would have given the free fermion propagator, but with mass mf. The effect of square root of z psi in these expressions, okay, is that there will be 2 factors of square root of z psi, right? One from here, one from there. So the single particle contribution to this 2-point function will be z psi times the free fermion propagator, except that the mass that enters here is the physical mass of the fermion and not the mass parameter that you started with, right? Because this is your this u alpha is the u alpha that corresponds to the physical fermion mass. Okay, it satisfies an equation of this kind. So the single particle contribution is given by this, and then of course there are multi-particle contributions which are denoted by these dots. Okay, is this clear? Are there questions? Okay. Okay, so here I have written that expression again. Now let's consider its Fourier transform, and the Fourier transform of this 2-point function I'll denote by G tilde f, alpha beta. Okay, again alpha refers to psi, beta refers to psi bar. So that's given by this, and that we can easily see that because this is the free fermion propagator, will be getting z psi. Sorry, I think this should have been a not root z psi. This should have been a z psi. Okay, the square. Forget about the square root. This is the z psi. So when you substitute, you get z psi times the fermion propagator in the momentum space, and that you know is I over p slash minus mf. Okay, m has changed to mf, right? And then this is z psi. And then the dots represent multi-particle contribution, okay, which we'll not worry about right now. So this we can also rewrite by multiplying by this p slash plus mf on the in the numerator. Okay. Then the denominator just becomes minus p square minus mf square plus I epsilon, and the numerator becomes p slash plus mf. Okay. And this basically uses the relation that p slash plus mf times p slash minus mf is nothing but minus p square minus mf square. Okay, that's the origin of this. Okay. So this is again similar to what we had for scalar fields, okay, except that this for the scalar field there is a z, okay, which is z for the scalar, and this factor was not there, right? This is specific to fermions. But the main point remains unchanged. Main point is that we can find mf in perturbation theory simply by looking for the poles of G tilde f. And you have to do this as in scalar field theory by resumming the series, okay, which I am going to describe. But are there any questions up to this point? So what we learned from here is that the momentum space Green's function of the momentum space 2-point Green's function of fermions contain information about the physical mass of the fermion as the location of the pole in as a function of p square. Okay, if there is a pole at p square equal to minus mf square, then mf is the physical mass of the particle.
So would you scroll up a bit?
Here?
No, where we define the Green's function in the momentum space.
This one.
No, like in the in the general case.
I see. Yes.
Here, if we integrate over both x and y, won't we get some additional singularities?
You will get additional delta functions, right? So the full 2-point Green. So this what I have described here, okay, is not the full 2-point Green's function. Okay, it's the part of the 2-point Green's function that strips of the delta function, right? Otherwise, if you integrate over both x and y,
We'll simply
you'll
get
have
an
you'll have a p1 and p2, right? So you'll basically get a 2 pi to the 4 delta 4 p1 minus p1 plus p2. That's the extra factor you'll get.
Okay.
Okay. Otherwise, it's so this is the part of the Green's function that is a non-trivial part, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is not exactly the same as what we had here. Okay? Because here you integrate over every x, right? So you should have integrated over x and y in that formalism. Okay. So this G tilde f notation is slightly different. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, I'm a bit unsure how we are supposed to determine these normalization Z.
Yeah. So basically, you determine the normalization Z by calculating the residue at the pole, right? We know how to resum, right? So you
Yeah.
have to expand around p square equal to mf square, right? Or p square equal to minus mf square. In the scalar field theory also, right? That you had this sigma, we resummed and wrote it as p 1 over p square plus m square minus sigma.
Yeah.
And basically you have to expand after you determine mf up to a given order, or there you called it mp up to a given order. Okay? You have to expand the denominator in power series in p square now, okay, around mp. Okay? At p square equal to mp square, the term is 0, term vanishes. Okay? And then you have to look for the next order term in the expansion. Right? That's what determines z.
Okay.
See, given any function, right, which has a pole, you can calculate its residue, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same principle here, right? Except that here the function is known only approximately up to a given order in say coupling constant, right? But once you have gotten the function approximately, you calculate the residue at the pole by exactly the same way that you calculate in any ordinary function.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, if there is a confusion, maybe at some point, either today or maybe next lecture, okay, we can work this out. Okay, how you calculate the residue at a pole.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, so let's see now how to do this resummation. Okay, and we'll follow exactly the same procedure that we did for the scalar fields. Okay. So G tilde f, the leading contribution is just the single propagator I over p square plus or minus p square minus m square. Okay, and with a p slash plus m in the numerator. Okay, so that's what I've written here is I over p slash minus m. Okay, that's this term, and perhaps it's not very visible. There are arrows. Okay, so basically the left index is alpha, right index is beta, and the arrow goes towards the side. Okay, that you should keep in mind. Okay, so let's see what we have. So this is the first term. Sigma is a matrix now, okay, because it has the alpha beta index on the two ends. So this one is I over p slash minus m. Okay, then I sigma p1. This, okay, this is not p1, this should be p, right? Because I have denoted this by p. So this is I sigma p. Another I over p slash minus m from here. Here I over p slash minus m, I sigma p, then I over p slash minus m, I sigma p, I over p slash minus m, and so on. Okay. And then you can easily convince yourself that this can be resummed, okay, in this structure. Okay. Conversely, if you take this, okay, and if you expand this out in power series in sigma, you'll exactly generate this. Okay. Maybe I can try to describe this in some detail because this matrix expansion may not be very familiar. Okay. So basically what we are using here is that if we have, say, A plus B inverse, we can write this as A times 1 plus A inverse B inverse, right? This is, so far it's okay, right? Because A plus B is A, if you expand it out, A plus B, right? Now, inverse of the product of two matrices is the product of their inverses, but in the opposite order. Okay, so this is 1 plus A inverse B inverse times A inverse. Okay. And now if B is small, okay, which is the case here, B is like R sigma. Okay. If B is small, we can expand this out as 1 minus A inverse B, the usual Taylor series expansion, plus A inverse B, A inverse B, then there is a minus times A inverse. Okay. So which at the end gives you A inverse minus A inverse B A inverse plus A inverse B A inverse B A inverse and so on. Okay. And that's exactly what we have here. Okay. So A is like P slash plus M, right? So the first term is P slash plus M inverse, then P slash plus M inverse, then sigma P slash plus M inverse, and then so on. Okay. So that's basically what we are using. Okay, so this expansion is to see that this is the same as what we have here. Okay, we think of this as A plus B, right, as a matrix inverse, and expand it out in the power series. Okay. So this then is the form of G tilde F after the summation. Is this clear? Okay. Now it's still a complicated matrix inverse, okay, but one can in fact show using Lorentz invariance, okay, that the general structure of sigma, even though sigma is an arbitrary, to begin with, sigma is can be an arbitrary 4x4 matrix. Okay. Using Lorentz invariance, one can show that the general structure of sigma has this form. It's some function of p squared times p slash plus some other function, okay, which I'm calling minus g of p squared. Okay. So given this structure, we can now substitute here. Okay. So then that gives G tilde F is I over p slash times 1 plus fp square. You just combine these two. Okay. And then minus m minus gp square. Okay. And this you can simplify further by multiplying, okay, both numerator and denominator. Okay. Now here I am multiplying numerator and denominator as if they are numbers, okay, but the reason that you can do it is because the matrices that you are using all commute. Okay. So you multiply by p slash times 1 plus fp square plus m plus gp square. Okay, that's what I have done here. In the denominator, when you do this multiplication, okay, the p slash times 1 plus fp square with p slash times 1 plus fp square just gives you this, because p slash square is minus p square. The cross terms cancel because 1 is minus, 1 is plus. Okay, and then this term is minus m plus gp square whole square. Okay. So now looking for location of the pole of G tilde F is the same as looking for the zero of this function over here. Okay, that's what will determine the physical mass of the particle. Is this clear? Are there questions? Okay, so let me go to the next slide. Okay. So this is what I have said here. The physical mass mf is the location of the pole in the minus p square variable. Okay. So that leads to this equation. You just substitute for p square minus mf square. Okay. So you get mf square times 1 plus f of minus mf square whole square minus m plus g of minus mf square whole square is 0. Okay. And now the idea is that because f and g are small, right, these are typically of order e square or higher, we can solve them iteratively. Okay. So to do that, we just write the equation in a slightly different way, okay, which is MF. You keep MF on one side and everything else you take to the other side. Okay, even though there are MF factors on the right hand side. To the 0th order, you just set F and G to 0. We get MF equal to M. Then to first order, we use this value of M to calculate MF. So that's M times M plus G of minus M square over 1 plus F of minus M square. And then you can go on like this. Okay? And of course, you can, since G and F are only calculated up to a given order in E, typically. Okay? You can, of course, stop whenever you have exceeded that order, right? You are supposed to take this and expand it out in power series in E, okay? And stop at the order up to which you have calculated G and F. Okay? There's no point in expanding this further, okay, if G and F themselves are only approximately determined. Okay? So that's the way we calculate the relation between MF and M in perturbation theory. Okay? So this is the same kind of principle that we use for scalar fields. Okay, other questions? Okay. So here I have said, okay, but maybe as I said, we can go through it some other time, that when this wave function enormous constant, which are what these are called, Z psi, these can be calculated simply by evaluating the residue of this function at p square equal to minus mf square. Okay. And again, you do this iteratively, by perturbatively, right? Because you cannot determine them exactly, okay? But to any given order, you can calculate the residue, okay? Because the function itself, once f and g are known to a given order, right? The function is known, so you can calculate the residue of this function. And here, let me just add, okay, which again I have already said in the context of scalar fields, that MF and Z psi, okay, these are both UV divergent. Okay. When I say they are both UV divergent, I mean that when you try to express them in terms of the function as functions of M and E, okay, once you go beyond the leading order, of course, MF is M and Z psi is 1. Okay. But once you try to go beyond leading order, okay, you can get formal expressions for them as functions of M and E, but they are ultraviolet divergent. And then you have to do a suitable regularization, which first makes these divergent terms finite, and then you carry out the renormalization procedure. So that part of the story is the same here as in the case of scalar fields. Okay, other questions, comments? Okay, so if not, let me proceed. Okay. So now we are going to discuss the photon propagator. Okay, and the discussion will be more or less identical. Okay. So for this, we start by calculating this. Okay, even though I have written it in terms of this curly mu, you should keep in mind that the only information that it has is the transverse components of the gauge fields, right? Because A0 is by definition 0, and A parallel is also 0, right? So this the information that it contains is about the transverse components of the gauge fields. In any case, so this again for x naught larger than y naught, it's this, right? You insert a complete set of states. For x naught less than y naught, it's the opposite order. Okay, again you insert a complete set of states. This, as before, includes some of all states, but we will focus on the single particle states. And in this case, charge conservation tells us that this state must be neutral. So if it's neutral, it cannot be a single electron state or a single positron state. Okay, the only thing that can contribute is single photon states. Okay. Of course, you ignore the bound states. Okay, that this is perturbative. Okay. So we focus on the contribution from the single photon states. Okay. Now here there is a slight difference from what we had earlier. Okay. Because in this case, if we use Lorentz invariance, okay, Lorentz invariance in fact requires that the states are exactly massless. So photons don't get photon masses don't get renormalized. Okay. And one simple way to argue this is to note that we have seen that the photons carry spin 1. Okay, if you calculate construct the angular momentum, the conserved charge corresponds to the angular momentum, okay, and apply on the photon states, you will find that the eigenvalues are plus minus 1. Okay, the allowed spin components along the momentum and opposite to the momentum are plus or minus 1. So you have a spin 1 particle, okay? But a spin 1 particle typically is supposed to have 3 different states, right? In particular, if you could go to the rest frame of the particle, okay, which is what would happen if the particle is massive, then just rotational invariance will demand that you must have 3 spin states, not 2. Okay, and the rotation, of course, is part of the Lorentz group. Okay. So the only way you can reconcile this, that there are 2 states instead of 3. Okay. And the 2 states is built in the formalism, right? Because this mu, as I said, contains only 2 transverse degrees of freedom, right? Its component along the momentum as well as the 0th component are 0. Okay. So the only way you can accommodate 2 states, okay, and spin 1 is if the state is massless. Okay. And that's the general argument which shows that the states should remain exactly massless. Okay. And we will argue later how to see this in perturbation theory. Okay. But this is general result that follows from Lorentz invariance. Okay, are there questions, comments? Okay. So from now on, you just proceed as in the case of scalar field theory. Okay. So again, we will try to find the general structure of this. Okay, the state is labeled by its momentum and the 2 polarization states, which are denoted by C. C takes value 1 or 2. Okay. Again, this matrix element, okay, X dependence is found by translation invariance, that's it to be IP dot X. Okay. And now rotational invariance, okay, tells us that this matrix element has this structure. Okay. So this eta bar, let me remind you, the eta bar has 0th component 0, and its spatial components are the transverse vector, the two transverse vectors. Okay. And this partly follows because A0 has been set equal to 0, the component of A along the momentum has been set equal to 0. Okay. The fact that this C is matched with that C, okay, follows from rotational invariance, right? That is something that you have to work out and check. For example, if C is 1, okay, this could have been in general a linear combination of eta bar 1 and eta bar 2. Okay. But rotational invariance will tell you that this has to be exactly eta bar 1 if C is 1, and if C is 2, this has to be eta bar 2, right? So that's the only non-trivial information that is in this equation. Okay. And this is a conjugate relation. Okay. And again, these relations, okay, that if you consider actually free fields, okay, and replace this curly mu by the standard gauge field mu, okay, then these relations hold with z equal to 1. Okay, so all that happens in the interacting theory, okay, for the single particle states is this extra normalization factor square root of ZA that I have introduced here. Okay. And now if you substitute this here, okay, in this expression and calculate the contribution for a single particle state, you see that this is given by ZA times d mu nu. Okay, this is a photon propagator, the free photon propagator, and then this is the only extra ingredient that you have. And if you look at the Fourier transform, okay, again, this is the Fourier transform in one variable, not in both variables. Right? If you look at the definition of the 2-point Green's function, momentum space Green's function that we had given, there will be an additional factor of 2 pi to the 4 delta 4 K1 plus K2. Okay, if this was written as a function of K1 and K2. So this is ZA, okay, that's the constant that comes from the squaring this root ZA. And then this is the standard photon propagator in the momentum space. Okay, any question? Okay, so here I have written this equation again. Okay. So this means, so what this tells us, okay, is that a 2-point Green's function of 2 photons, okay, will continue to have pole at k square equal to 0. Okay. Now this is a somewhat non-trivial statement, right? I mean, okay, I said Lorentz invariance guarantees this. Okay? But on the other hand, we can explicitly calculate this, right? After all, you know how to calculate two-point function in perturbation theory. Okay? And we can carry out an analysis similar to what we had earlier, right? Just like here we resummed, right? We resummed to calculate the shift in the mass. Okay? You could do the same thing here. Okay, so you could introduce, for example, the 1pi two-point function I sigma a, and write this as product of the first term will be d tilde, then there will be d tilde times sigma times d tilde, then d tilde times sigma times d tilde times sigma times d tilde, and so on. And you can ask, how do you see that the pole doesn't get shifted? Okay, because I am claiming that the pole doesn't get shifted, but there is a non-trivial sigma. How do you know that the pole doesn't get shifted? And this is proved, okay, explicitly, okay, not by using this indirect Lorentz invariance argument, but explicitly, okay, by using what is called the gauge invariance of the theory. Okay. One can show by general properties of the theory, okay, that sigma mu nu, okay, has this general structure. Okay. It is some function of k square, okay, and this is a finite case, some function of k square of the finite value at k square equal to 0. Okay. And then we have this k mu minus k square times theta mu. Okay. And using this structure, this I'll leave as an exercise to you. Okay. We can prove, okay, that the pole in k square remains at k square equal to 0. Okay, so once you use this structure, okay, then you calculate this d tilde mu nu plus d tilde sigma d tilde sigma d tilde sigma d tilde, and so on. Okay. You will find that the pole is not shifted.
Sir?
Yes, go ahead, please.
The photon propagator is not gauge invariant, right?
Photon propagator is not gauge invariant, no.
So why should sigma be gauge invariant?
Yeah, the point is it is true that the photon propagator is not gauge invariant, but the sigma one can show is gauge invariant. Okay, again, this is some property. Let me maybe try to. Okay. So let's see the sigma, the first contribution to sigma, right? What will you get? Right? This is the contribution to sigma. Okay. This doesn't know anything about the photon propagator, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, non-propagators, right?
Pardon?
I mean, why are there arrows?
Oh, because this fermion is propagating in the middle. See, this is sigma, right? 1pi contribution. Sigma mu nu. So this is mu. This is nu. Okay, external lines are cut off. So this is a contribution to sigma mu nu, right?
Okay, yeah.
Is this notation clear?
Yeah, I kind of understood. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay. So this doesn't have any information about the photon propagator, right?
And
Basically, there is a gamma mu.
mu.
So what is the expression for this? This is trace of gamma mu. Then if this is, say, P, let's say this is P minus K, and this is K. Gamma mu, okay, I'm just not writing the all the I factors. So the trace will go this way. So minus K slash minus M gamma nu and 1 over P slash minus K slash minus M. Right? So I've written, you have to go opposite the arrow. So this is gamma mu here. Okay. This one gives you this 1 over minus K slash minus M. The minus sign comes because the K is flowing opposite to the arrow. Okay. Then this factor gives you gamma nu. Okay. And then the top propagator gives you 1 over P slash minus K slash minus M. Okay. So this one can show is gauge invariant, right? This K mu acting on the P mu acting on this should give you 0. Okay. So there are properties of gauge invariance which are called word identities, okay, which you can show to show that the sigma mu nu actually is gauge invariant. Okay. Then you can consider more complicated objects, right, when there is an internal propagator like this. Okay. Here, of course, the internal photon propagator has is not gauge invariant, right? It has all these ends around, but again, one can show that only the gauge invariant part contributes.
This can also, the internal propagator,
Yes.
this can also be shown using the argument that you gave for the cancellation of the electron, the J square and the photon propagator term.
Yes, exactly. So the n nu term gets cancelled.
So in the end, eta mu nu upon minus p square plus I remains.
Exactly. Right.
Okay, yeah.
So the point is that there are these other terms p mu k nu plus k nu p mu, right? Those terms all cancel, right? After you sum over diagrams, one can show that those terms all cancel, and
Yeah,
at the end you will be left with just eta mu nu over k square, the Feynman propagator. So it's not completely trivial, but one can show that indeed the sigma mu nu is gauge invariant. Okay, and that's what constrains the structure of sigma mu nu.
Sir,
Yes, go ahead, please.
the way we are showing is that it looks like we are considering a diagram or a set of diagrams and then showing that for each of that term, it will come out to be gauge invariant. That looks like an order by order statement that at every order we can show it's gauge invariant.
Yes.
I mean, we should be able to show this without the expansion also.
Yes, we can. I mean, there are the general word identities, right, which
General
you can show are valid for general two-point functions, right, which are consequences of gauge invariance of the theory. Okay. And that's what you can use to show that this structure of sigma holds. But if you want to see order by order, you can see that also by explicitly in terms of Feynman diagrams.
What are they called? General what?
Word identities.
Would you write the name?
Yeah, word identities. So these are basically the constraints that the various Green's functions of the theory satisfy because of gauge invariance.
Okay.
Okay, and using that you can prove these various properties of the Green's functions, and the particular one that I mentioned is also a consequence of the word identities. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me maybe also say one more thing, how exactly one goes about making use of this. So basically what happens, so see, suppose you write sigma as some h of k square times k nu minus k square eta mu nu. Okay. And now we have the first term is d. Okay. Then we have a d times sigma times d, right? I'm not writing the indices very carefully. Okay. Now what one can show is that if you take d mu nu k nu, that's identically 0. Okay, or d tilde. This is d tilde, not d. Or in random momentum space. So this is identically 0. Okay, so that basically means that this part of sigma drops out from this, right? Because k mu hits d. Okay. So what remains is a k square part. Okay, and k square, remaining k square part means that you had to begin with, you had the first term had 1 over k square. Okay. Then the second term had a 1 over k square on two sides. These are coming from the two d's. Okay, but then we get a k square. Okay. Because this term remains, right? So that means that these cancel. Okay. So the order of the pole remains always 1 over k square, right? Every term, every successive term, okay, goes as 1 over k square, 1 over k square, 1 over k square, and so on. Okay. The only thing that changes is the overall multiplicative constant. Okay, so that's part of z. Okay. So because the pole is always 1 over k square, after you sum them, right, the pole position doesn't shift. Okay. If, for example, if the pole was if the pole was something like 1 over k square plus, let's say, some small number, okay, so we call it a square, okay, some small number. And if you are expanding in parts of a, then what you have gotten is 1 over k square first, then minus a square over k square whole square plus a to the 4 over k square cube, and so on. Okay, so the order in each term, the order of the poles have increased at k square, k equal to 0, right? That's what tells us that after we resum, the pole position shifts. Okay, but that's not happens here because of this peculiar property of sigma, right? That there's a k nu minus k square. The k nu term drops out because that contracted with d gives you 0. Okay? And the k square cancels the 1 over k square from one of the d's. Okay? So the order of the pole doesn't increase. Every term has 1 over k square. And that means that the k square, the pole remains at k square equal to 0. Okay, so that's the general argument why you don't have shift in the pole. So this is from the perspective of Lorentz invariance. This is from the perspective of gauge invariance, but as I said, you can also argue in general based on Lorentz transformation, okay, that the photon pole shouldn't shift. Okay, just because you have 2 degrees of freedom, 2 states, okay, and a spin 1 particle will require 3 states if it's massive. Okay, are there questions? Okay, so now let me say how to calculate the S matrix, and then I'll stop for today. So the S matrix basically can be analyzed in the same way as in the case of scalar field theory. The only extra ingredients that we have compared to scalar field theory, we proceed exactly as in the case of scalar field theory. The only extra ingredient that we have are these. Okay, the fact that there are these eta bars appearing in these matrix elements. Okay, for the in and out states, you will now get these extra eta bars. And similarly for the fermions, for the in and out state, we'll get these extra U's and V's. Otherwise, the analysis is identical to what we had earlier. And I'll give now the final result for the S matrix. Okay, so first we introduce, as in the case of scalar field theory, the amputated Green's function, okay, which I'll call by gamma tilde, which will denote by gamma tilde. Okay. And we introduce these by simply factoring out the external 2-point functions from the momentum space Green's function. So this was the momentum space Green's function, okay, with all the delta functions put in. Okay. We denote gamma tilde, we define gamma tilde as the amputated Green's function, where you factor out the 2-point functions. And what we factor out are these. Okay, so notice that for photons we factor out mu prime k. Okay, this is the external photon propagator. Okay, so the index here mu is different from the index here mu prime, right? Similarly, alpha prime, beta prime. So you factor out the photon propagator. Okay? You factor out the fermion psi propagator, psi bar, and this is psi bar psi. Okay? The signs are not hard to understand. Maybe I can just illustrate this again by one example. Let me. Let's consider just one single amplitude. Okay. Okay, so this is the photon mu. This is psi alpha. This is psi bar beta. And now we call this alpha prime, we call this beta prime, and I call this mu prime. And on this, you have the full Green's function insertion. Okay, so I'm denoting by the shaded regions. Okay, so this blob means sum over all diagrams. Okay. So here, okay, let me draw also the momentum. So the momentum levels are K going here. Okay, then this I think I'm calling P going towards psi and L going towards psi bar. Okay, let's draw the arrows. Okay, the arrows have gotten hidden. Okay, the arrows are here in this way. Arrows are here in this way. Okay, sorry, not this way. Mistake. Oops. Okay. Okay. So for this line, right? Okay, for this line, you are just going to get d mu, the 2-point function g mu mu prime of k. Okay. For this line, okay, you will get the 2-point function sf. Okay. It goes from alpha to alpha prime. So not sf, sorry, gf, to full 2-point function, right? This is the full 2-point function. Okay. So gf alpha of alpha prime. Okay. And k, because k is flowing along the arrow. Okay, that's the convention you have used. So this is giving gf alpha alpha prime of k. Okay. And here you get a gf of beta prime beta, right? Because the matrix indices go opposite the arrow, gf beta prime beta. Okay. And minus L, okay, because L is flowing towards outside. So if the momentum always, but in our definition, momentum always flows outwards. Okay. But here the momentum is flowing opposite the arrow. So this is gf beta prime beta of minus L. Okay. And that's what I have written here. Okay, so let me go back and I'll show you the expression. Okay, so that's the reason for this minus L and why the indices are reversed here, beta prime beta. Okay, but you have to just draw this diagram once and convince yourself that this is the case. And the reason that I have introduced this gamma tilde is because the S matrix will be expressed in terms of gamma tilde. Is that definition clear?
So
Yes, go ahead, please.
P and L have the dispersion relation of like P0 is square root of P square plus F square.
Yes, indeed.
So when we feed that into the amputated Green's function,
yes,
in the fermionic propagators as 1 over P slash minus M,
yes.
there we feed in MF or M.
No, MF, because amputated means you are amputating the full external 2-point function, right? Not just the one single propagator.
Yeah.
Right? So there also it's MF, right? Because you are actually factoring out the full G tilde F.
Yes. So in all the amputated diagrams,
yes,
the amputated part, we should write 1 by P slash minus MF.
Well, it's more than that, right? As the level of the Green's function, 1 over P slash minus MF is just the pole part.
Yeah, I'm excluding the other factors.
Yeah, but you have to amputated means you basically amputate everything. Okay, so let me go back again, right? Amputated means that if you have a diagram like this, right? Oops. Let me draw a photon. Okay.
Yeah.
Then this whole thing is removed.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you are amputating is the full 2-point function that includes the full GF, right? Which means the pole is at 1 over p at MF.
Yes.
1 over p slash minus MF, right? If we just look at the pole part, but you are just removing the whole 2-point function.
Yeah, that part is fine. But even the center, this blob has diagrams, right?
Yes, indeed. So this will have its own diagram, right? This can have something like this. This can have diagrams like this and so on.
And that will give propagators which are integrated over, I mean, in the sense.
Yes.
So I'm asking for that. That also has some, let's say D4L and 1 over L slash minus M or plus M, whatever.
Yes.
Is that M or MF?
Well, individual lines have M, right? But if you try to resum in the intermediate, in the internal states, right?
Yeah.
You will get back the full 2-point function. But you don't have to do it that way, right? In the internal, you are working up to a given order.
Yeah.
So you may choose not to resum.
Yeah.
Right? Resummation is necessary on the external lines, right? In the internal lines, you may choose to resum or you may not, right? Because you'll always work to a given order in the coupling constant.
Yeah. So we should in terms of some, let's say E square order,
Yes.
we'll write it in terms of M only.
Yes, you will write this in terms of M only. So for example, this line itself, right, has M.
Yeah.
Right? The whole thing may have MF. But you are summing over these diagrams anyway, right? So it will automatically become MF after you sum over all the Feynman diagrams. But this is not something that you have to put in explicitly.
And the dispersion relation in L, like when we are writing D4L 1 over L slash minus M, that L slash is some L mu gamma mu.
Yes.
In that L mu, that L0 is L vector plus MF or M? I mean square.
In the dispersion relation,
Like with that is independent, right?
yeah, L0 is independent, right? In the internal loops,
Yeah, okay.
L0 has no constant, right? You are integrating over L0 independently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the level of the Green's function, amputated simply means that you just remove the external propagator. That's all.
Yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So in the end, all the internal propagators are going to be replaced by this 1pi diagrams, right?
All the internal propagators.
I mean, if there's a line, let's say this photon line in this blob.
Yes.
Coming from this top to bottom.
Yeah.
In the end, if we take all the corrections,
yes,
there should be a 1pi propagator that we
not
were
1pi, the full
using
propagator,
to
right?
find the mass of.
Yeah, it will have
The full pi propagator.
the full propagator. Yes. So it will have, for example, there will be terms like this. Right? These will also have to be added, right? And if you want, you can try to add all of them together and write it as a full propagator. But in the internal line, it's not so important, right?
Yeah, because we are only evaluating it to
a given order.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But if it helps, you may try to reorganize this as a full propagator if you want.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So maybe I'll just do one thing. I'll show you the formula and then I'll stop. Okay. Next time we'll continue with this. In fact, more. Yeah. So basically, what we'll do next time is to write down the expression for the S matrix. Okay. So we have a S matrix now will be characterized by a set of incoming fermions. So incoming photons, incoming electrons, and incoming positrons, and outgoing photons, outgoing electrons, and outgoing positrons. So the S matrix will be a function of all of those quantum numbers. Okay. And basically, what one can show by following exactly the same route as in scalar field theory is that there is an explicit expression for the S matrix that you can write down using. What happened to this? I should. Okay. basically using this amputated Green's function. Okay. But I think I'll elaborate on this more next time. So I think today already time is up, so I'll stop here. Are there questions?
So why do we call photon its own antiparticle?
Well, because photon, okay, I mean, we'll define charge conjugation, okay, later, and we'll see that under charge conjugation, photon basically remains itself.
Okay, and is this true for scalars also?
Yeah, it's for neutral scalars that you have considered, right? It's true for that also.
Okay.
And basically the photon field, right? The same field contains A and A dagger.
Okay.
Okay. Whereas for the fermions, right, the psi, for example, contains B and D dagger, and it's psi bar which contains the B dagger and D, right?
Yeah.
So that's why there's a difference between the particle and antiparticle, right? The same field doesn't contain both the field and the particle and its conjugate. Okay? But when you define the charge conjugation operation later, then it will become clearer. Because charge conjugation is a particular symmetry. Okay? And the question is whether under that symmetry transformation, the particle changes to something else or it remains the same.
But at the level of fields, we could have taken some linear combination of them and redefined our fields.
Yes, so you could
have a mixture of all the B and D daggers and annihilation and creation both.
Yeah. So to make it precise, as I said, you have to first define charge conjugation.
Yeah.
And then you have to ask, right, whether under charge conjugation the particle remains the same or not.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So once you define charge conjugation, I think it will become clearer.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Sir?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, in the expression of this sigma,
Yes.
or the full 2-point gain function in terms of sigma.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I say that we demand the gauge invariance of sigma because it ultimately affects the 2-point gain function and which contains something physical, like physical mass or something.
Yeah, we
Fermion mass.
can say that, except that, see, we cannot really demand, right? Because 2-point Green's function is something that we have no freedom, right? The Feynman rules tell us how to calculate the 2-point Green's function, right? So there we really have to prove that it has certain properties,
okay,
right? It's not something we can demand. Of course, we can say that, okay, if this is not true, then the photon will get a mass and then everything is inconsistent. So from that point of view, we can say indirectly it must happen this way. But once you have an independent definition of 2-point Green's function, then you should be able to prove its properties. Right? And indeed you can. I mean, as I said, this structure actually can be proven. That the fact that sigma mu nu has this structure can be proven using gauge invariance of the theory.
okay.
Okay. Any other question?
So one more thing.
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Can we could not also do this, right? We have could we write a Lagrangian with a Maxwell's field and with some term that gives photon a mass, let's say a mu m square, and yeah, we took the massless m going to zero limit to find all the let's say cross sections and everything.
Yeah. So for Maxwell's theory, right, that's very special. Right? It turns out that it is possible to define a massive vector field. Okay? But the best way to think of that is actually a spontaneously broken gauge symmetry. Okay? So what happens is if you try to take the zero mass limit of that theory, okay, what you will get is a massless photon, okay, and a massless scalar. Okay, so the field content in the zero mass limit, okay, splits up into a massless vector and a massless scalar. Okay. So a Maxwell field, so if you just naively add m square mu terms, so this is something that you can do for Maxwell's theory, but not in a general gauge theory, right? The non-abelian gauge theory that are at the heart of strong and weak interactions, right? You couldn't do this. But in Maxwell's theory, you can do this, and you can understand the zero mass limit as a combination of a massless vector and a massless scalar. So that's the way the number of degrees of freedom remain intact, right? That you had three states to begin with, right? And in the massless limit, you still have three states, right? Two polarizations of the photon and one scalar.
So I mean, even if this happened in the massive case, the photon had three spin states, +1, 0, and -1.
Yes.
So how would this break into spin 1 and spin 0 state, spin 0 particle?
The point is, if you look at the SZ component, right?
Yeah.
That matches up, right? Because the spin 0 and the spin up, and spin a spin 0, massless spin 0 has SZ equal to 0, and a massless spin 1 has SZ equal to ±1.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is no immediate inconsistency, right? But to show that it happens, you have to do some work, right? I mean, as I said, the best way to think of this as a spontaneously broken gauge symmetry, where you start with a photon coupled to a scalar. Okay? So, for example, you can consider a photon coupled to a scalar where the scalar gets a vacuum expectation value, and that breaks the gauge invariance, right? That produces a massive vector field. And there you can see clearly that the degrees of freedom of the scalar and the photon combine to give a massive field.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is that I mean, there's no inconsistency, as you can see, right? I mean, you cannot pinpoint a clear inconsistency if I tell you that a massive vector is the same as that in the mass going to 0 limit becomes a massless vector and a scalar, because the SZs do match up, right? And you cannot say anything other than SZ in that case, because in the massless limit you cannot go to the rest frame.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So that's the point. So it's all internally consistent because in the massless limit you cannot go to the rest frame.
Okay.
Sir?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, isn't it the MEME term is not gauge invariant, right?
What is not gauge invariant?
The mass term of Maxwell's field, MEME.
Yeah, it's not naively gauge invariant, right? But there is a way to define. I mean, there is a way to formulate the theory, right, where you have a hidden gauge invariance in the theory. As I said, the best way to think of this as a theory of a scalar coupled to a vector, okay, massless vector, and in that theory, by doing an appropriate manipulation and taking appropriate limit, you can get this massive vector field.
Okay, so for that, in the action of this for this Lagrangian, do we write m square term with scalar part or the vector field?
No, so in that formalism, you don't write m square with the vector, right? You have a scalar field with a negative m square, in fact.
Okay.
And after you do the spontaneous symmetry breaking and everything, you effectively get a Lagrangian which has a mass term for the vector.
Okay.
But the initial Lagrangian that you start with doesn't have a mass term for the vector explicitly. It's perfectly gauge invariant. Yes, go ahead, please.
So the free part of the standard model, is it all quadratic in the fields?
Well, free part by definition is quadratic in the fields.
So if we were to consider, like in classically also people have considered non-linear Maxwell's equation, right? When they add quartic terms of F mu nu to the action.
Yes.
So if we were to do that, like even though there is no external coupling with some other field or anything, we still have some like non-linearity in the action, which will give rise to some perturbative expansion.
Yeah, exactly. So that will have, for example, the 4-photon coupling.
Yeah. So have people done that?
Yeah, I mean, if you try to use, say, F mu to the 4 term in the Lagrangian, okay, you will have 4 photon coupling, okay, except that there is no experimental evidence for such a thing, right? I mean, that is, of course, 4 photon coupling, but that comes from the fermion loop, right? In the Feynman diagram, you can have a fermion loop with 4 photons attached.
Okay. Yeah.
But there is no experimental evidence that there is a genuine 4 photon coupling term in the action.
Okay.
Right? But if there is such a coupling, you will certainly get a 4 photon scattering from there.
And likewise, if we modified our equations to give a monopole or something,
Yes.
like would it change our already seen experiments or something?
Yeah, it would in general. I mean, it depends on what you add, right? But anything that you add to the Lagrangian will affect the experiment at some point, right? Now, you may be clever enough to write terms in the Lagrangian so that it will not affect the experiment that have been performed so far.
Yeah.
But in general, there will be some experiment which will be sensitive to that term.
Okay.
Right? For example, if you add a 4 photon coupling with a very, very small coefficient, it may not be observable today, right? So based on today's experiment, all one can say is that there's a bound on how big the coefficient can be.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the next class we'll have to start, so I'll log out. And tomorrow there'll be no class. We'll continue next week.
Okay. Happy New Year.
Okay, Happy New Year.